Hello, everyone. I've been rereading David Allen's second book, which is called Ready for Anything. And if you haven't run into it, I highly recommend it. The story behind it that David tells is a great one. He basically says that he, after he wrote his first book, Getting Things Done, it started to sell exceptionally well, as it does to this day. And the publisher said to David, he said, "Hey, David, this is great. Can we have another book, please?" And David said, reflecting on how long it had taken him and all of the years of the consulting that he'd done and all the evolution of his ideas, he said, "Well, it only took me 25 years to come up with the first book. How long have I got?" And the publisher said, "Well, ideally, we'd like something a bit sooner than that, please." So what David realized in that moment was he actually had been producing, today we would call them blogs, but back in the day, I think he called them newsletters that went out to a mailing list. And what he did was he worked with an editor to go through those blogs, those newsletters, and 52 of them made their way into this book called Ready for Anything. And they're great, 2-3 pages, so not a long read per chapter. And each one of the chapters is a bit of a deep dive into some of the the best practices, the models, the ways of working, the ways of thinking. And I was rereading one of the chapters that talks in particular about a realization that David came to, that he has sort of two personae when it comes to his productive self. There are two different sort of sections of him, as it were. One persona is called, he calls the doer. And the doer is about forward motion in the sense of, deciding next actions, executing on next actions, making things happen, okay? And the other part, the other persona that he reckons that he's got is this thing, this part of him that he calls the visionary. And the visionary is happier to have a cup of coffee, to do some reflective thinking, to maybe think a little bit more strategically, to see if some inspiration comes from thinking about bigger picture outcomes, okay? And as I was reading that, I was reflecting on my own situation and what I've sort of experienced in working with clients. One of the interesting things that David said was that he recognizes that if he's in visionary mode, right? So in other words, if he's thinking big picture or he's inspired to be thinking in that way, it can actually be quite aggravating if his doer persona starts to try to butt in, right? Because he's thinking big picture, he's thinking strategically, and the doer, in essence, is saying, "Yeah, but how are you going to do that? Wait a minute, how are you going to? What should I do? Let's get going, right?" And vice versa. He said if he's in doing mode, right, executing on next actions, that he finds that it's quite, it's quite unhelpful. That the visionary might pop up and say, "Hey, I know you're doing that next action, but there are all kinds of other things that we can consider whether we should do at this moment." Right? So I guess I'd encourage you to think about, what does this look like in your own world? Do you agree? Do you have these sort of two halves of your productive self? And if so, is one or the other of them getting too much attention? Is one getting neglected? Right? I was thinking about this in my own practice, and I think if I'm honest, I probably spend a little bit more time in the doer mode than I do in the perspective mode, in the visionary mode, and that's something that I'm going to work on over the next little while to try to remedy. By the way, David talks in this chapter in very practical terms about the fact that, hey, use your inbox to if something, if you're working on something, right? So if you're a bit more in doer mode and something occurs to you that's a bit more visionary, just jot down a note and drop it in your inbox, or do it digitally if that's how you capture. But use your inbox to make sure that you can sort of stay in whichever persona is helpful, right, at that moment. Another thing he talks about is, practically speaking, in his own system, the next action lists, right, and the calendar. That's where the doer focuses. Those are the tools that'll support the doer. Whereas the projects list and the someday maybe list, he says, are he calls them the trophy case of the visionary, which I love. I think they're things for the trophy case of the visionary, which is beautiful. And then he makes a really important point at the end. For those of you familiar with GTD, this will not be at all a surprise. He says, once a week during his weekly review, he gets his doer and his visionary together for a bit of a team meeting, okay, to come up with integrated thinking about his world. So I hope that's helpful. Drop me a note in the comments if you have any thoughts or observations about that. Please do like and subscribe so you'll find out when we publish more content like this. And if there's anything that you'd like us to be talking about in the work that we do, please do let us know. Bye for now.